Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. So, something a little different, kind of. I did this before where I do the kind of, just the voiceover of the channel because it just helps when I'm traveling and for so many other reasons if I'm having a bad hair day, which is, you know, every time I record. But it seemed to get a good response last time I did this. I did ask people whether they liked it and whether I should continue, but it did get a good response, so I thought I'd do this one again. And I'm going to keep this basically for when I'm doing product reviews. It just seems to fit better because you don't need to see my face when I talk about it. So today we're talking about the Sega Game Gear. Now, if anybody, there may not be, but if anybody remembers me from my Twitch days when I was gaming over there some time ago, a few years ago now, then you will remember that this is my favorite handheld game system by far. It's not even close, okay? The Game Boy is not as good. It never was as good. The only reason that the Game Boy beat the Game Gear is because it was cheaper. The Game Gear had every advantage over the Game Boy from day one. The problem is it was literally double the price. And so parents buying their kids consoles went for the obvious Game Gear from the very trusted and of course long-lived Nintendo, rather than going with Sega at double the price, because, you know, for the price back then, which is the late 80s and 90s, Game Gear being at around £165, so near to $200 at the time, not the best of looks. So let's get into the background and the legacy of this system. So it was launched in 1990 in Japan, and then 1991 it came to North America and over to Europe. It was Sega's answer, obviously, to the massively successful Game Boy. Now, the Game Boy did come out a little bit earlier, but of course, we weren't in colour yet. We had a green screen. There was no backlight. There was nothing like that from the Game Boy. And it's a very different setup on how it looked. Unlike the Game Boy, obviously, the kind of monochrome display, the Game Gear actually had full colour backlit screen from day one, which is obviously a major selling point. This is something that happened from day one. It's something I've been onto gaming podcasts and talked about. A friend of mine and an amazing YouTuber, especially in retro stuff, Wrecked Wizard, has talked about this with me. I've been on a previous podcast of his and chatted about this. Do go and check him out. Amazing in the retro gaming stuff. But this is something we went back and forth on. This had obviously a vibrant display. It really set it apart from its competitors. It offered way more of an immersive gaming experience that I remember as well. I mean, the Game Gear is what I had. I had the Game Gear. It was designed to be basically a portable version of the Sega Master System, which, as an overall system, I didn't have that. A friend of mine had the Sega Master System. I actually had the Nintendo Entertainment System. So this is the weird thing. I wasn't a fanboy for any particular gaming console, gaming system. I had the Nintendo, I had the NES, but I had the Game Gear because the Game Gear was better. I know this is very much on me. This one has hit far more. You'll notice on my other reviews, I am far less emotional about the thing. But with this, there's a lot more emotion, a lot more kind of, no, this one I know. This one is one I really get behind. It shared a lot of the hardware of the home console as well, between the Sega Master System and the Game Gear. It allowed for like really easy porting of Master System games. So, you know, it had a massive library right from the start. You didn't have to kind of build into it. The console boasted a resolution of 160 by 144 pixels, and it could display up to 32 colors at once from a palette of 4096. That's immensely impressive for the time. Obviously, if you were saying that to somebody now, they'd be like, yeah, what? But back then, we're talking over 30 years ago, this was amazing. One of the key features of the Game Gear was the design. Unlike the Game Gear, now this is a big point that I've brought up so many times as well, is that if you look at handheld systems now, The layout is far, far nearer to the Game Gear than it is to the Game Boy, because the Game Boy had a kind of boxy shape, whereas the Game Gear was designed to fit in your hands. It had the buttons and the D-pad. They were easy to reach. It also included a headphone jack and a TV tuner that obviously is accessories, but it allowed you to be able to watch TV on the go. This is something I don't think we really talk about as much, as this was a backlit colour screen that you could play basically all the systems of the back library of the Sega Master System. You had a headphone jack and you could watch TV on it. It was almost like the early days of a smartphone. It had so many features. Now, obviously, it was still put down by the technology of the time, so it wasn't like it was as clean and crisp as you'd get on things now. But for what it was back then, it was insanely versatile. The Game Gear's library included a mix of original titles and obviously the ports over of popular Sega games. Obviously, some of the standout ones were Sonic the Hedgehog, which I'll be honest is probably the game I played the absolute most on this. Columns, Shining Force, and Streets of Rage. That's a big one. That's a big retro one that a lot of older people will remember, the Streets of Rage. These games showcased the console's ability to deliver actually fast-paced action and, for the time, very rich graphics. Now, again, looking back on it, it's not going to look the same, but back then it did. It's a bit like looking back at old films from back in the day and going, well, that's not believable, but actually, for the time, it was amazing. It made it a favourite among gamers who actually wanted kind of arcade-like experience, which I guess is potentially why, for me, it was my favourite, because I was actually a bigger fan of going to the arcade and playing than I was of home gaming. There was just something about it with the arcade, and that really kind of played into it a lot for me. Despite its advantages and its features, the Game Gear did have significant challenges. One of the biggest one, which I don't personally agree with, but it is one that I have to mention because I've heard it from so many people, and I think this may actually be something distinct to the areas in which it was sent out to, was the battery life. So the console required 6 AA batteries and could only run for about 3 to 5 hours on a full charge, which was obviously a lot less than the Game Boy's battery life, and it made it less convenient for long trips. However, this could be different for a number of reasons. One, the UK and many European countries are nowhere near as big as somewhere like the US. So where the US, it would be a big problem for a long car journey, in the UK or in most European countries, that's not an issue. It's your entire journey. Or it's a significant part of it, at least. It wouldn't be the entire journey, but, it would have been a significant part of it. I also never personally had the issue, and I probably had a lot of batteries on me ready for it as well, but I never came across this personally, and no one I knew ever came across this. I know it was an issue, because I've heard it from people, but I never personally had this issue, and no one that I know in the UK ever had this issue. So I don't know whether it was the build quality that sent out to different places. I simply don't know. On top of this, the Game Gear, now this one, yes, this is definitely true. It was larger and it was heavier, but I don't care. Okay, people do argue that it was less portable. So obviously less portability wasn't as good. However, I put it in my pocket for school. I used to play this on like game days and things. I just put it in my pocket and have it at school. So I never found a problem with it as portability. And I realize I am biased as hell. I am giving you facts. These are the things that are there, but I know I am being incredibly biased. But I've said from the start, this is my puppy. This is one that I've argued for before. And I do have a Game Gear again. I did go into the shop and I went into a retro place and I got a brand new one. Well, brand new. You know what I mean. It's not my original one. And I got another one, and oh my god, it is so good to have the Game Gear again. It's obviously the higher production costs of the colour screen and more powerful hardware also, and this is where I think the actual reason for its demise comes, made it significantly more expensive. And when I said at the beginning double the price, I was not being hyperbolic. It was literally half the price. The Game Boy came out at around £80. The Game Gear was around £165 for the time. So it made it a lot harder for certain families, certain people to have, or at least you could kind of, you know, if you had multiple kids, for instance, you know, it was far easier to be able to buy 2 Game Boys and keep everyone happy than maybe buy 2 Game Gears. So, or even just 1 Game Gear. So it's a definite factor. But of course, as I've said, it had higher costs because it was better. But the problem is, it wasn't something you necessarily looked at, and especially at the time, it wasn't necessarily something that was a big factor. People just wanted the kind of best for their buck type thing. Now, even with these challenges, it did maintain a huge fan base. I am one of them, and it sold around 10 million units worldwide. This is not a small amount. Now, granted, if we do it by modern days, like the Switch or something like that, yes. But we're talking about a world that was not as global back then at all. We're talking about a world where gaming was not really the norm. You know, we didn't have Twitch. We didn't have YouTube. Hell, we didn't have Google. None of this stuff existed to be able to do any of this, and yet it still sold 10 million units worldwide. It also received several redesigns and revisions, and it had a massive lifespan. Actually had a smaller version as well. It had like a micro that got released in 2020. There was a micro in 2020 as part of kind of Sega's anniversary celebration. But the fact that it has this longevity, has this place in people's minds that 30 years on from its release, they go, you know what, we're gonna do another version, is kind of showing just how good it was. The legacy of the Game Gear can still be felt. I mean, it was one of the first handheld consoles to offer a color display and backlighting. And actually, when I mentioned this, I talked about my friend Wrecked Wizard, who, again, go and check them out. But with Wrecked Wizard, when I talked about this, his immediate question was, oh yeah, but it wasn't backlit, was it? Otherwise it would have done better. I just went, yes it was. Immediately, yes it was. It's just not remembered as much. Features like this became the standard now. So when you look back, you look at the Game Boy, you look at the Game Gear, and you're going to go, okay, which one of them looks like now? And it's the Game Gear. Pretty much all of those features now are seen in the game systems we have now, the handhelds that we have today. Its influence is absolutely evident in the design and the capabilities of the later handheld consoles that came after it. The Sega Nomad, and even contemporary devices, as I've said, like the Switch. Look at the Switch and tell me that it didn't get influenced by the Sega Game Gear. It absolutely did. Obviously, in recent years, the Game Gear has actually had a resurgence in popularity, possibly because of people like me that are just saying how amazing it is and always had. It's a lot of it comes actually from people like Wrecked and people like that are into retro gaming. The retro gaming industry has obviously been brought up a lot, and so this has kind of come forward. It has a pretty unique library, and the nostalgia evokes kind of strong feelings of childhood for a lot of people, and so it's a sought after collector's item. I probably didn't pay as much as it's worth from the version I have. You can actually get emulators and modern re-releases of Game Gear titles that pop up all over the place. So, I mean, overall, the Game Gear was a pioneering handheld console. It pushed the boundaries of portable gaming, and while, yes, it wasn't as well received as the Game Boy, its innovation and the features that it gave, the impressive library, everything absolutely cemented it in history for so many. Yes, there are still people that haven't heard of it, but I think that will change over time. It remains a massive, beloved piece of hardware, and it's still being celebrated by people worldwide right now. And I think that's something we should remember, is that the Game Boy did not actually lead the way. People always think it was. It was not the Game Boy, it was the Game Gear. Remember that. I hope you've enjoyed this review, and I'm sure there's going to be people that disagree with me, but I will stand firm. I will absolutely stand firm. The Game Gear, without question, runs rings in actual gaming and ability and everything than the Game Boy by far. It also allowed me to watch a little bit of TV when I was at school. So you can't say better than that. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. Again, a bit different having it as just me on the voiceover. But, you know, this was well received last time. And hopefully, unlike some of my other channels where I do voiceovers, people don't assume I'm AI, because I'm not AI. I'm a real boy. So I hope you've enjoyed, and I will see you again on Monday. Thanks, everyone.